What transpired that night was completely unexpected. Feeling my son's presence instead of my wife's was one of the most surreal, yet strangely exhilarating experiences of my life. It began like any other typical quiet evening at home. The house held its usual tranquility after dinner, the dishwasher humming softly in the kitchen, and the subtle creaks of the settling wood providing a quiet soundtrack to the night. I had absolutely no inkling that this particular night would irrevocably change my perspective on everything: my life, my family, even myself. My name is Peter, and until recently, I thought I had it all figured out. I'm 43, a dedicated worker who's built a comfortable, if not extravagant, life for myself and my family. My wife Laura and I have been married for 18 years, and although our relationship has encountered its share of challenges, I always believed our bond was strong. We have 2 children. My daughter Clara is away at college, and my 19-year-old son Ethan still lives at home while attending community college. Ethan has always been a reserved young man. Laura and I used to joke that he was the yin to Clara's yang. While she was a whirlwind of energy and enthusiasm, Ethan preferred the quiet solitude of his room, engrossed in books or absorbed in some new project that had piqued his interest. Over the years, I occasionally worried that he might feel overshadowed by his sister, or even by Laura and me. But whenever I broached the subject, he'd offer a reassuring smile and insist he was perfectly content. As he grew older, however, I observed subtle shifts in his demeanor. He seemed more withdrawn, and his usual shy smiles became fleeting glances. There were times I'd catch him looking at me, a certain unreadable expression in his eyes, something inquisitive, almost questioning. I dismissed it as typical teenage awkwardness and didn't think much of it. Laura was out of town for a few days on a business trip. She works for an events company and frequently travels for conferences and planning meetings. It was a regular occurrence, and I was accustomed to managing things at home while she was away. With Clara busy with her studies, it was just Ethan and me in the house. The first night after Laura's departure, Ethan was unusually quiet. We ate dinner together, and I attempted to engage him in conversation, asking about school and the 3D model he'd been meticulously crafting for weeks. He responded politely, but his replies were brief, his eyes darting to mine and then quickly away, as if he was apprehensive about something. "Everything all right, bud?" I inquired, furrowing my brow. "You seem a bit quiet tonight." He offered a small smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired, I guess." I didn't press him. Ethan had always been introverted, and I assumed he'd confide in me if something was truly troubling him. I retired to bed as usual. Laura's side of the bed felt particularly empty, and I found myself acutely aware of her absence, the warmth of her body beside mine, the soft murmur of her voice as she drifted off to sleep. I switched off the lights, closed my eyes, and let the rhythmic sounds of the house lull me into slumber. Sometime during the night I was roused by the faint creak of the bedroom door. I squinted into the darkness, my heart momentarily faltering. The room was silent except for my own breathing and the soft rustle of fabric as someone approached. "Laura?" I mumbled, my voice thick with sleep. My initial thought was that she had returned home early, perhaps to surprise me. The figure didn't reply. Instead, the mattress dipped slightly as the person sat down on the edge of the bed. My drowsy mind struggled to make sense of the situation, but before I could fully awaken, I felt a gentle hand on my leg. It was a familiar gesture. Laura's hand on my arm or leg, her way of reassuring me, her way of saying she was there. But something felt amiss. The hand lingered for too long, the touch too hesitant, as if whoever it was attempting to replicate her movements, but wasn't quite sure how. I opened my eyes, my vision adjusting to the dim moonlight filtering through the blinds. What I saw stopped me cold. Sitting beside me wasn't Laura. It was Ethan. "Ethan," I said, my voice a mixture of bewilderment and alarm. "What are you doing?" He didn't move, his hand still resting lightly on my leg. His face was partially obscured by shadow, but I could see the anxiety in his eyes. His lips parted as if he wanted to speak, but no words came out. "Is everything okay?" I asked, sitting up, my pulse quickening. I could feel the warmth of his hand through the fabric of my pajamas. "Why are you—" "Dad," he interrupted, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't mean to wake you." I frowned, my confusion deepening. "Then why are you—" I... he... he stammered, his hand withdrawing as he looked down at the floor. I don't know, he said softly. I wanted to make sure you were okay. I stared at him, unsure of how to respond. The way he looked at me, so uncertain, so vulnerable, made my chest tighten. I'm fine, Ethan, I said gently, but you should be in bed. It's late. For a moment he remained motionless. Then slowly he stood up, his shoulders slumped. Yeah, sorry, I'll go. As he turned to leave, something compelled me to stop him. I didn't know what it was. Perhaps the way he looked so dejected, or the strange pang of guilt twisting in my gut. But I let him go, watching as he disappeared through the doorway. I lay back down, staring at the ceiling as my mind raced. What had just happened? Why had he come into my room like that? And why did it leave me feeling so disturbed? But the strangest part was, it didn't end there. Oh no, the story definitely didn't end there. Not yet. The next morning I woke earlier than normal, having barely slept a wink. Ethan's unexpected visit had left my mind racing, replaying the scene every time I closed my eyes. The way he perched on the edge of the bed, the hesitancy in his voice, the lingering touch of his hand. It was unsettling, but not in a way I'd anticipated. I pushed the thoughts aside as I got ready, and by the time I made it downstairs, Ethan was already at the table, nursing a coffee and scrolling through his phone. He glanced up as I entered, his expression neutral, yet a stiffness in his posture betrayed something unsaid. Morning, I offered, striving for a casual tone. You're up early. Yeah, he replied quietly. Couldn't sleep. I paused, then poured myself coffee and sat opposite him. Ethan, about last night. I'm sorry, he interrupted, his voice sharper than I expected. I didn't mean to freak you out or anything. I shouldn't have come into your room. It's okay, I reassured him quickly. I was worried. You seemed upset. He shrugged, his eyes returning to his phone. It's nothing. Forget about it. But I couldn't forget it. The way he'd looked at me, the way he'd touched my arm, it was too deliberate, too weighted to be dismissed so easily. It had stirred something in me I couldn't quite define, and the strangest part was I sensed something from him too. I wanted to probe further, to understand what was going on in his head, but something in his demeanor cautioned me against it. So, for the time being, I let it drop. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. Ethan kept to his room, and I occupied myself with chores and errands, trying to shake the lingering disquiet. By evening, I was exhausted and ready for bed. I tried not to dwell on the previous night as I slipped under the covers, but my mind wouldn't cooperate. What had prompted Ethan to come to my room like that? Was something troubling him that he wasn't sharing? Or was it something else? Something I was hesitant to acknowledge. I must have drifted off eventually, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by the creak of the door opening again. My heart leaped, and I sat up, peering into the darkness. Laura? I mumbled, even though I knew it wasn't her. The figure in the doorway hesitated before entering, and the moonlight revealed Ethan's familiar silhouette. My pulse quickened with a blend of confusion and something else I couldn't name. It was as if the same scenario was playing out again in my mind. Ethan? I questioned, my voice a mix of concern and exasperation. What's going on? Why are you here again? He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked over and sat on the edge of the bed, just like the night before. He wore a loose t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair tousled from sleep, and there was a vulnerability in his posture that tugged at me. I'm sorry, he said softly, his gaze fixed on the floor. I know this is weird. I didn't want to be alone. Why? I asked, softening my tone. What's wrong, Ethan? You can talk to me. He hesitated, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. I don't know, he admitted. It's just, Mom's gone. Clara's not here, and the house feels so empty. I guess I just wanted, I don't know, to feel close to someone. His words resonated with me more deeply than I expected. I'd been so consumed by my own loneliness in Laura's absence that I hadn't considered its impact on Ethan. He'd always been quiet and reserved, but perhaps that was his way of dealing with the same feelings I was grappling with. "It's okay," I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone, Ethan. I'm here." He looked up, his eyes searching mine, and for a moment the air between us crackled with an indefinable energy. I squeezed his shoulder reassuringly and smiled, attempting to diffuse the tension. "Come on," I said, patting the bed. "If it helps, you can stay here for a bit. But you have to promise to actually sleep, all right?" I didn't know why I said that, because in some way, I felt as if I didn't want to sleep again either. He nodded, a small smile breaking through his nervous expression. "All right. Thanks, Dad." Ethan lay down on the other side of the bed, maintaining a respectful distance. I switched off the light and closed my eyes, trying to ignore the strange cocktail of emotions swirling within me. The room was silent except for the sound of our breathing, and I could feel his presence beside me, a warm, steady pulse. At some point I drifted off, but my sleep was restless. I awoke again in the dead of night, my senses hyper-alert. I wasn't sure what had roused me at first, but then I felt it. A light, hesitant touch on my arm. "Ethan?" I whispered, my voice thick with sleep. He didn't reply, but his hand lingered, brushing gently against my skin. It was such a tender, deliberate gesture that my breath hitched. My mind screamed at me to say something, to stop this before it went any further, but my body refused to cooperate. "Dad," he murmured, his voice barely audible. I'm sorry, I turned to face him, my heart pounding. His face was inches from mine, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and longing that I couldn't ignore. Before I could speak, he leaned in, his lips brushing against my cheek in a gesture so fleeting and gentle that it left me stunned. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling, but not with fear. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice cracked. I don't know." The air thickened with tension. A silence stretched taut between us. I wanted to speak, to break the spell, but I was frozen, my thoughts a chaotic jumble. Ethan pulled back slightly, his expression a blend of shame and desperation. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I shouldn't have done that. I'll go." Before I could react, he was gone, vanishing into the darkness, leaving me alone with the crushing weight of what had just transpired. I realized I hadn't minded. In fact, I quite liked it. When he left, I knew I wanted more. I'd never experienced this before, but for now, I decided to try and ignore it, planning to invite him to sleep with me again tomorrow, and then perhaps talk about it. The following day, I couldn't concentrate. My thoughts relentlessly returned to Ethan, his hesitant touch, his whispered apology, the feather-light brush of his lips against my cheek. It was all too much, too strange, yet impossible to dismiss. Ethan avoided me all morning, remaining in his room with the door closed. I lacked the courage to knock. I reasoned he probably needed space to process what had happened, and honestly, so did I. But as the hours crawled by, the tension in the house became suffocating. By mid-afternoon, I couldn't bear it any longer. I found myself standing outside his door, my hand hovering inches from the wood. For a moment, I considered turning back, but then I knocked softly. "Ethan," I called, striving for a steady voice. "Can we talk?" There was a long pause before I heard his footsteps approaching. When he opened the door, he looked different. His usual guarded expression was replaced by something softer, almost vulnerable, and it made my chest ache. "Hey," he said quietly, stepping aside to let me in. I entered his room, taking a moment to look around. It was neat and organized, just like him, but an air of uncertainty hung in the space. He gestured for me to sit on the bed, and I complied, though my nerves urged me to flee. "I just wanted to check in," I said after a moment, "about last night." He winced, his shoulders hunching slightly. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I know it was weird. I shouldn't have—" "Ethan," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "It's okay. I'm not mad. I need to understand what's going on. He hesitated, his hands fidgeting in his lap. I don't know, he admitted finally. I guess I just feel really alone sometimes. And when Mom's gone, it's like, I don't know, like the house feels empty, even with you here. His words struck me deeply. I'd always strived to be a good father, but hearing him say he felt alone stung. Ethan, I'm sorry if I've made you feel like that, I said gently. You're not alone, okay? I'm here for you, always. He nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on the floor. I know. It's not the same. What do you mean? I asked, leaning forward slightly. He took a deep breath, his hands clenching into fists. It's hard to explain, he said, his voice barely a whisper. It's like, I want to be close to you, but not in the way I'm supposed to, and I don't know what to do with that. His words hung in the air, heavy and raw, and I felt my stomach knot. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to dismiss it, to tell him it was just a phase. But another part, the part I didn't want to acknowledge, felt an inexplicable pull towards him. Ethan, I began carefully, I think you're confused. It's normal to feel... I'm not confused, he said firmly, cutting me off. His eyes met mine, filled with a quiet intensity that made my heart skip a beat. I know what I feel, and I know it's not normal, but I can't help it. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, we sat in silence, the weight of his confession pressing down on us like a physical force. I wanted to comfort him, to reassure him that everything would be all right, but I didn't know how. This was uncharted territory, and I was utterly lost. I still hadn't told him how I felt, but what was yet to come would turn the story on its head. That night, I tried to act as if everything was normal. We ate dinner together, discussing mundane things like school and work, but an unspoken tension lingered between us, unaddressed. I could feel his eyes on me whenever I glanced away, and it made my skin prickle with a mixture of unease and something else I couldn't name. I wanted to ask him to join me for the night, but when I tried, I simply couldn't. I couldn't open my mouth. When I finally went to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the night wasn't over. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. Ethan's words replayed in my mind, his voice filled with such vulnerability and longing that it left me breathless. And so, I got out of bed and went straight to Ethan's room. He was still awake. Ethan, I whispered. He didn't answer at first, but I knew he'd heard me. Ethan, would you like to join me for tonight? Are you sure, Dad? He said. Yes, son, I replied. I'd love to. He didn't hesitate. He climbed straight into my bed, his weight causing the mattress to dip slightly. He sat there for a moment, hands resting on his knees, before reaching out and placing a hand on my arm as I got into bed as well. Dad, he said softly, his voice trembling, please excite me like a mom. I stared at him, my mind screaming at me to stop this, to say something, anything, that would put an end to whatever was happening. But I couldn't. The raw emotion in his eyes, the tremor in his voice, it paralyzed me. Ethan, this isn't... I started, but he cut me off. Don't, he whispered, his grip tightening on my arm. Just let me stay, please. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. Okay, I finally managed, my voice shaky. But we need to talk about this in the morning. He nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. Thank you, he murmured, settling beside me. A confusing storm of emotions raged within me, fear, guilt, and something dangerously akin to anticipation. I didn't understand what was happening between us, but one thing was certain. This wasn't over. I turned, and our eyes locked instantly. The tension between us was undeniable, a silent acknowledgement of the inevitable. I sat up, my mind racing. This isn't okay, I said, my voice wavering. You need to go back to your room. I don't want to, he replied, his gaze unwavering. I don't care if it's wrong. I can't keep pretending I don't feel this way. Before I could respond, his hand brushed my cheek, a touch so soft, so reverent, that it sent shivers down my spine. Ethan, please, I whispered, my voice trembling. This isn't... He leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was both hesitant and insistent. My mind screamed at me to stop, to push him away, but my body refused to obey. For a moment, everything else vanished, the fear, the guilt, the sheer impossibility of it all. There was only Ethan, his touch, his warmth, his desperation. And in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to pull away. The kiss lingered, longer than it should have, longer than it had any right to. Ethan's lips were soft, tentative, yet there was an urgency to them, a desperate need to close the distance between us. My mind still urged me to end this, to regain control, but my body betrayed me, frozen, incapable of action. When he finally pulled back, his eyes searched mine, filled with a mixture of fear, longing, and something that looked dangerously close to hope. "Ethan," I breathed, my voice barely audible. "We can't. This isn't—" "I know it's wrong," he interrupted, his voice trembling. "But I don't care. I can't keep pretending, Dad. I can't keep hiding how I feel." "You don't mean that," I said, shaking my head. "You're confused. This isn't real." "It is real," he insisted, his gaze unwavering. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." His words hit me like a wave, leaving me breathless and disoriented. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was mistaken, but the conviction in his voice, the raw honesty in his eyes, made it impossible to deny his belief. "I don't know what to do with this," I confessed, my voice cracking under the weight of the moment. "I don't know how to fix this." "You don't have to fix anything," he said, taking my hand. His touch was warm, grounding, and it made my pulse race despite myself. "Just let me in, please." I pulled my hand away, my chest tightening with a mixture of fear and guilt. "Ethan, this isn't about what I want. It's about what's right. And this isn't right." He looked down, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I know you think that," he said quietly, "but I also know you don't really believe it. Not completely." His words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Guilt? Shame? Or was it the terrifying realization that a part of me didn't want to push him away? A strange excitement flickered within me. I met his gaze, and I think he saw it too. The tension shifted, morphing into something entirely different. The way he moved told me we'd both been feeling this for days. The kiss had awakened something I couldn't ignore. After a long silence, I said, "Kiss me again, Ethan." His surprised, "What?" echoed in the room. "Do it, Ethan. As you said earlier, pretend to do what Mom would do." I didn't hold back. Something had fundamentally shifted within me. Ethan leaned in, and we kissed again, this time different, better, more intense. He touched me as Laura would. Things escalated. I couldn't stop it, and I didn't want to. I won't go into detail, but it was intense, sensitive, and from his side, perhaps a bit rough. He seemed to have embraced his role as Laura with unsettling seriousness. The way he said my name afterward confirmed it. He lay there, and we both lay there, unsure of what had just transpired. "Are you okay, son?" I asked. "Yes, Dad. Don't worry about me. Let me go to the bathroom, and then let's just go to sleep. That's the last clear memory I have." I think I dozed off while he was in the bathroom. I woke early the next morning, replaying the previous night's events. I was halfway through my coffee when I heard footsteps on the stairs. I knew it was Ethan without turning around. His presence filled the room before he even spoke. "Morning," he said softly, tentatively. I turned to face him, offering a small smile. "Morning. Coffee's on the counter." He nodded, pouring himself a cup. We stood in silence, the tension palpable. Finally, I broke the quiet. "Ethan," I began, setting down my mug. "We need to talk." He stiffened, his shoulders tensing. "About last night," he began, his voice barely a whisper as he turned to face me. "About everything," I replied. "I need to understand what's happening with you, with us." He hesitated, his gaze falling to the floor. I don't know, he admitted. I feel like I've been holding this in for so long, and I couldn't anymore. I know it's wrong, Dad. I know that. But I can't help how I feel. His words hit me hard. I wanted to tell him he was mistaken, that these feelings weren't real, but the look in his eyes told a different story. This wasn't a fleeting thought or teenage confusion. It was something deeper, something that frightened me more than I wanted to admit. Ethan, I said carefully, I need you to understand that what you're feeling, it's complicated. It's not something we can just act on. He nodded, his expression pained. I know, he said quietly, but that doesn't make it go away. Silence descended again, heavy with the weight of his confession. I wanted to comfort him, to reassure him that everything would be all right, but I didn't know how. This was uncharted territory, and I felt like I was walking a tightrope, one wrong step away from disaster. The rest of the day was strained, to say the least. Ethan stayed in his room for most of it, and I tried to distract myself with chores and errands, but my thoughts kept returning to him. Every time I pictured the raw vulnerability in his eyes, my chest tightened. As evening approached, I sat in the living room with a glass of whiskey. Ethan appeared in the doorway, hesitant, hands shoved in his pockets. Yet, there was a determination in his eyes that made my heart race. "Can I sit?" he asked quietly. I nodded, unable to speak. He sat beside me on the couch, leaving a cautious space between us. "I'm sorry," he said after a long silence, "for making things weird. I didn't mean to. I just didn't know how to handle it." "I know," I said softly. "It's okay. We'll figure this out." He looked at me, his eyes filled with such vulnerability that it made my chest ache. "Do you hate me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Of course not," I said immediately, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I could never hate you, Ethan. You're my son." He flinched slightly at the word but didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into my touch, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. "I just want to be close to you," he said, his voice trembling. "I don't care how. I need you." His words broke something inside me. I pulled him into a hug, holding him tight as he buried his face in my shoulder. "I'm here," I whispered. "I'll always be here." For a moment it felt like everything might be okay, that we could find a way to move past this and rebuild our relationship. But as he pulled back and looked up at me, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears, I felt that familiar tension return. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "for not giving up on me." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. As he stood to leave, I reached out and took his hand, stopping him. "Ethan," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "we'll figure this out together." He smiled, a small tentative smile that sent a pang of warmth through me. "I know we will," he replied. As he walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that our story was far from over. The lines we had drawn were blurring, and though I didn't know what the future held, one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again.